Beyond the labels we wear, underneath the fear and competing ideologies, we are all looking for the light to bring dignity, understanding, and redemption where there's been pain and confusion. Welcome to Brave Nation with me, Leigh Sloan. Let's pursue the wisdom and courage we need to create lasting reform right here, right now, starting with you and me. Thanks for joining me today. Today it's just me and you, and I want to talk to you about how to navigate the treacherous waters of tribal affiliation, most specifically when it comes to politics. And many people don't realize how much the Bible has to say about things that I like to talk about, like sociology and the interaction between that and politics. Now, I found a few keys for you that you might find helpful as you steward your vote and your political activism. I believe in God, of course, and that He cares about social movements, and He's even actively engaged in them. It's all throughout the Bible. And that He wants us to be, number one, innocent as doves, in that we maintain our right principles, but also wise as serpents, which means that we have good strategies for winning. And in this case, we're going to apply it to winning the culture wars. So, how do we think about the role that we play in cultivating unity on the one hand, and yet drawing necessary boundaries that we need, even when it can at times create the need for a clear dividing line? As Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 3, there is a time to tear down and a time to build. There is a time for war and a time for peace. Our American system of elections gives us the freedom to choose our representatives, which I'm very grateful for, but it also inadvertently rewards some of the unhealthy tribalism that causes our communities sometimes unnecessary division. So how do we know if our engagement in the system is part of the problem or part of the solution? It's not a perfect system. It never will be because it has people involved. But it can be better or it can be worse. Now, we don't want to disengage altogether from politics. Like I always say, that's like wearing white gloves. It does nobody any good. But we have to know how to do it right. We need the guardrails in place to help us engage with integrity. And that's why this conversation is so important. So what does Jesus have to say about this? Well, he said something in the Gospels that when I first read it, I thought, wow, Jesus seems to contradict himself. In one place, the book of Mark, he says, "If you are not against me, you're for me." And then I would read over in Matthew, in a different context, he says, "If you're not for me, you're against me." Now, of course, let's just think about at first glance, even not reading any of the context around this. What are the implications of each of these statements? How are you likely to act if you believe that everyone who is not against you is for you? Well, you're likely to be more inclusive and trusting of people, right? You're likely to have a more positive outlook on life. But what if the flip side were true? What if you believe that everyone who is not for you is against you? In this case, you're going to be more of a pessimist and you're going to be very wary of trusting anyone. What did Jesus mean when he said this? Let's take a look first at Mark 9, starting in verse 38. "Teacher," said John, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us." "Do not stop him," Jesus said, "for no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Truly, I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward." So as you can see from this passage, the disciples were looking for a way to exclude others who were not part of their little club. As humans are, they were tribally protective. And by contrast, Jesus defends everyone who was advancing the mission of Jesus as one of us. He was trying to teach his disciples that they didn't own a monopoly on the truth, that anyone could access it and use it to set people free, even people they had never met. Jesus was no respecter of persons. He was relentlessly inclusive. Now, when we care a lot about what we're doing, we tend to become gatekeepers of that thing in a way that actually hampers the overall mission. Here's an example from my own life. As an educator I ended up forming my own educational program to meet a need in my city. But it's possible that I could feel threatened by the school or program down the street who's doing a similar thing. But if I'm serious in my belief in the freedom to educate as I choose, and as we choose, I will support all teachers who are trying to do a great job at what they do. I would only oppose the people who are using the educational system to rob kids of a quality education. Now, if I'm truly doing it for the benefit of my community, I'm going to be inclusive in my mission and not seek to tear others down who might be, quote unquote, competing with me for students. That is a mission focus over a more selfish mission monopoly kind of thinking. Now let's take another look at Matthew, at Jesus's seemingly contradictory statement. If you're not for me, you're against me, he says exactly the opposite in this next context. Do you think Jesus was being schizophrenic, or was he articulating a different side of a paradox? So let's take a look at Matthew 12, starting in verse 24. But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons." Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. If Satan drives out Satan, he's divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? And if I drive out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your people drive them out? So then they will be your judges. But if it's by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or again, how can anyone enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man? Then he can plunder his house. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters." So as you can see from this passage, the Pharisees were looking to lump Jesus in with Satan because he was interacting with demons. But Jesus is pointing out that his mission and the mission of demons was diametrically opposed. And he's essentially asking them, "Well, what are you doing to oppose Satan? Let me hear your notes," right? He's subtly pointing out that they are the ones truly opposing the work of God. Jesus was being gaslighted by these Pharisees into trying to show Jesus as a person on the wrong side of truth, when in fact they were threatened by him being able to do what they were actually unable to do. And Jesus knew if they really had the heart to set people free, they would be trying to learn from Jesus, helping him, or at least cheering him on. But instead, they gaslighted him and accused him. Because he wasn't one of them, they were trying to find a way to disqualify him. And in a way, they were acting similar to Jesus' disciples in the first passage. They were putting their own tribalism above the ultimate mission of setting people free. So this sort of unhealthy leader will demand that someone be for them or on their team without enduring any questions of what they stand for or why they're doing it and what they're all about. They will consider everyone who's raising questions as their enemy and a person who is disloyal. And it's this thing I'm calling mafia-style alliances. I'm kind of writing about this more in my next book. So here's the paradox. The first statement, if you're not against me, you're for me. The Jesus in Mark is inclusive of everyone who aligns with his mission. But on the other hand, the other side of the paradox, if you're not for me, you're against me. The Jesus in Matthew is exclusive of everyone who pretends to care, but actively maligns the mission. You see how it's all about the mission? These two statements can both remain equally true at the same time. If we're really mission minded, we'll know how to be allies with anyone who's helping to further our mission, regardless of personal discomfort or cost. At the same time, we will be opposed to anyone who opposes our mission, regardless of whether we have a lot to lose by opposing them or not. It's all about the mission. And unless you happen to be a perfect person like Jesus, I'd say more often than not, you should focus on the statement from Mark more than the one in Matthew. Because we as people are prone to toxic tribalism. We're prone to excluding people rather than including people. Now, there might be some who might err on the side of inclusion, but I found that they're generally much healthier people than the opposite. On the other hand, there's another piece that we need to keep in mind. There are times when there are people around us who pretend to care what we care about, like the Pharisees did with Jesus, but they don't. And on occasion, we need to be careful of those wolves in sheep's clothing when they have shown themselves untrustworthy. We need to stay on mission and reject the efforts of those who attempt to get us off track. Now, putting this all in context, election season is upon us. Here in Alaska, we're gearing up for our primaries, which are done in a way different way through something called ranked choice voting. If you're not here in Alaska, you might not have heard of it, or maybe they call it RCV. Now, this new system has been implemented over the past few years here in Alaska, and it's very controversial. In fact, it has been banned in 19 states as of now, and a lot of people dislike it, but it's what we've got. So it's being put up on the ballot again in November. That means if you want to get rid of it, you'll vote yes. And if you want to keep it, you'll vote no. Now, in the years before ranked choice voting was introduced, we have had a primary system, which most states have, whereby any party could organize and then vote on their own representatives with their own registered members. This allows a party to decide together who will represent them on the ballot. Well, ranked choice voting did away with all that. It made it so anyone could register to be on what is known as the jungle primary ballot. Anyone, whether they were vetted by a party or not, could place their name on the ballot. And so this year, we happen to have a person with the same name as our current Senator Dan Sullivan, who registered to run right alongside him. He even changed his affiliation from Democrat to Republican so that he would look exactly like the other Dan Sullivan. You think that's really a coincidence? It would be difficult for those less informed voters to know which Dan to vote for. So recently, the decoy Dan, as they're calling him, is going to be listed as Daniel instead of Dan to help people make that distinction. We'll see if that really helps. So this is just one example of the possible consequences of ranked choice voting. Now, what else does ranked choice voting really do? Well, I've noticed that, yes, it does take away power from the parties, and maybe you think that's a good thing. I see how parties can be messy and frustrating, but we need to think about what happens every time power is redistributed. There's always an alternative group that benefits, even though the beneficiary is a lot of times hidden. With ranked choice voting, what most people don't realize is that it takes the most power from one group, from the most powerful and largest group or party. Now, while I acknowledge that, of course, I said parties can be problematic and toxic just like any other group, they are also a way of coming together and a way of creating a certain sense of unity around a set of principles. Even though we shouldn't elevate parties above all things, they are the ways that we've used for hundreds of years to galvanize people around a sense of purpose. Now, in a similar way, money, our system of free market and money, it's an indicator of value that a lot of people have ascribed to a good or service. And as we know, capitalism isn't a perfect system, but it's the most judicious system that we have. It doesn't impose control, but it allows the market to be free so that people can essentially vote for what they want with their dollars. And in a similar way, party affiliation isn't a perfect system, but it's the best one we've got. The value in traditional primaries is that it allows groups that ascribe to certain values to coalesce around those values and decide who among them will represent them. And unless the parties can accomplish this, maybe organically behind the scenes in their own polls, which hardly anyone's done, there's going to be a laundry list of people on that ballot, which makes it very difficult for people to research each candidate and less likely to actually participate and vote because it's very complex. And it also makes people pay more attention to polling, which in many cases is paid for by groups that are not objective and they're not scientific. And so people are more likely to base their votes, at least in part, on a very flimsy poll. Now, I'm mentioning all this because factors like ranked choice voting influence us more than we know. There's a pattern in sociology whereby groups seek to maintain a balance between group cohesion and group expansion. They have to choose between letting more people in and growing their power, and on the other hand, limiting the people who come in that are not in alignment with their agreed upon values. And it's sort of this waxing and waning for a sense of healthy equilibrium. In a group, it's vital that the group has some kind of adherence to a set of strong values, but it's also vital that the group can grow and expand. It needs ways of onboarding new members. Do you see the dichotomy here? And we see this in the ministry of Jesus. When he called his first disciples, he made the bar for entry pretty high, but still accessible to anyone who was willing to pay the price. He said, "Come, leave everything behind and follow me." Now, the bar wasn't financial or intellectual, or you couldn't be born into it, but it was a high bar of commitment. And then when Jesus began healing people, feeding them, setting them free, teaching amazing things, more and more people naturally sought him out. So he had crowds of thousands following him. And then one day he said, "Anyone who wants to follow me has to eat my flesh and drink my blood." And this was really confusing for Jews because this was the most unclean thing you could think to do. A big no-no, especially drinking blood, right? And in this way, a lot of people, a lot of his followers stopped following him. Now, Jesus knew that his popularity had the propensity to compromise the mission, and so he intentionally said something hard and a bit confusing to weed out those who were merely fans and not followers. It reminds me of the story of Gideon, when God told him his army was too big and he had to give them a series of tests to narrow down the ones that God had really picked to go into battle with him. Those seem like arbitrary tests, but God knew they needed a leaner army that was of one heart and one mind. So we can see this ebb and flow of party growth with these big tent parties, parties known for their willingness to accept new members, such as the Republican Party, realizing that not all of their members are true to their principles or platform. There's a term you may have heard called RHINO, which stands for Republican in Name Only. It's an acronym. And it refers to anyone who calls themselves a Republican but votes like a Democrat. Well, at some point, party affiliation is meaningless if it doesn't stand for anything. And so we need to maintain this equilibrium of not being too closed off to people who think a little differently, but we also need to maintain our core mission. Now, studies have been done on those who bring dissent to a group, and it's really fascinating. Those willing to stand up and disagree in a group on a particular matter. They found that dissenters bring valuable feedback to a group on areas that they can improve. And these studies showed that it is those who often care the most and who most identify with the group that often bring the strongest and most passionate dissent. But they found that the level of dissent and its valuable contribution sometimes had a limit. even though it was super valuable because it brings things to light that need to be brought to light. Dissenters were valuable until it crossed a line and they diverged into a totally different mission. So the study showed that once a person actually started working against the mission or having a fundamentally different vision of where the group should go, that was the point at which dissent became problematic. Now, are you making the connection now to what Jesus said about being against or for someone? As I showed you earlier, you can consider anyone who is for your main mission as being welcomed into the fold. But you need to notice when somebody in the group is trying to create a totally different vision. When you have two fundamentally different visions, there's a word for it. It's called division. That's right, division. And real division is bad for groups. Not just dissent. Dissent is good, but division is bad. So you can be a person that's very frustrated about those that, let's say, for example, trying to take the group away from a vision, that you label everyone who disagrees with you as a heretic in some way, whether you call them a rhino, or I actually found out, I didn't know this, but I guess the Democrats have a similar word, dino, Democrat in name only, or whether they merely have reasonable differences of opinion or whether they're in fact operating from an entirely different mission is sometimes difficult to pinpoint or judge fairly. But if you're too quick to label people in this way, even though they're just dissenting, maybe they don't have a completely different vision, but they just disagree with you on something, you could be unknowingly splintering your own movement and creating unnecessary division when there could have been a healthy exchange of ideas and you could have actually benefited from that person. So it's really important to know whether the difference is minor or major. On the other hand, if you have no boundaries and you don't require any sort of alignment to your vision or values, that could also put you in a really precarious place because you end up allowing people onto your team that are pulling you in totally different directions, and your team is likely to eventually fall apart. So you can work in tandem with someone who agrees with you on the what, but not the how. You can attend rallies with them and rub shoulders with them. And in political parties, we work on our party platforms because that helps us define our what. What principles do we stand for? What do we stand against? But within those parties or within those larger groups, we normally differ vastly on the how. The how has to do with culture. It's the way that we treat each other. It's the norms that define our behavior. And so when you actually work with someone more closely on a team, like a political campaign, you need a greater level of alignment. You need to not only agree about the what, but also largely about the how. And in this way, your expectations will be aligned with the other team members. Greater alignment is needed for greater levels of commitment. So we need to be able to be open to the possibility of making ourselves allies with lots of people, but team members with just a few. So here's my advice when picking from a vast number of choices for a jungle primary or any election for that matter. You need to vote with both your heart and your head. Your vote is not a Valentine. It's a vote for a practical course for the future that you prefer. So you need to consider, number one, what is this person's mission? Do you agree with them on what the problems are and what principles guide those solutions? That's the first thing. And then it's great if they can agree. Number two, it's great if they can agree with you on the how. How do you think the solutions are best accomplished? How do they normally make decisions in their own lives? And do you agree with the ethos and the culture of the team that they've created? That's the second point. And I'm saying these in order of importance, but here's number three. This is also really important. We don't want to forget this part. it is still important to consider who has the capability of winning. So we need to balance our need for alignment with a candidate for the practicality of picking a candidate who's capable of crossing the finish line. And in my opinion, ranked choice voting makes it much more difficult to do that, but it still is possible. You can't base it solely on polling unless you have a really scientific poll, but a lot of places don't have that. But base it on what you're observing. If when you're cheering on your favorite candidate and all you hear are crickets around you, it might be time to pick a new candidate who has the capability of getting you to the finish line. And this is what it means to me to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. The wisdom comes from the strategy and the practicality of opening your arms to people that are a little bit different from you. The innocent as doves part means that you should never lose track of your core values and the things that mean the most to you. Don't be a sellout. We all have the capacity to create unity or division, health or disease in our communities, in our organizations, and on our teams. Be brave enough to say to others, if you're not against me, you're for me. And to say only to those who are creating dangerous division, if you're not for me, you're against me. It's only when we have the wisdom to navigate the difference that we're going to be effective at creating significant cultural reform. I hope this helps you as you navigate the waters of the groups that you're a part of, whether they're political or not. Life is too short to waste with those who are not rowing in the same direction. So find your true team and go for it. Thanks for listening, and I'd love to hear your feedback, so please go to bravenation.online to get in touch with us and join our monthly Brave Nation Circle group where we do live group coaching and offer you tons of great bonus content. Now, if you've got something valuable from this podcast, please share. Consider giving us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps push this content out there to more people. Until next time, stay brave and stay wise.